We were still inclined to believe in the validity of orders. Perhaps these exercises would help us bring the war to a quicker end. At last, we were issued new clothes. Some of the uniforms were quite different from the ones we'd always known, with blouses like those worn in the French army today, and trousers tucked into short, thick spats, looking like a grotesque parody of a golfing costume. This new design was, for the most part, distributed to new troops. The Großdeutschland, as an elite division, kept the old design. We were even given new boots, a further sign of privilege. However, the cloth of the uniforms was of very inferior quality, much more brittle than formerly. It reminded us of specially treated cardboard. The new boots were also markedly inferior, made of rough, stiff, fourth-quality leather, which cracked at the ankle instead of forming the usual creases. The underclothes were the worst of all. They were made of a cloth which seemed to have substance only where it was doubled, at the hem and the seams. The new socks, which we appreciated immensely, also seemed curiously synthetic. "If this is what we're getting," Hal said, "I'll keep my Russian socks." In fact, the new socks were a great deal longer than the old ones. However, they were less warm. They were among the first to be made with nylon, which was still largely unknown. We slapped a great deal of black polish from the store onto the boots to make them lose their look of cardboard paste. We all felt better to be out of our stinking, tattered rags and into new clothes, despite the synthetic fabrics. Our brightened appearance also had its effect on the local inhabitants, who decided that all must be well with the Wehrmacht. Hals, in his fresh and dashing uniform, had fallen in love once more, this time with a pretty young Polish girl. With him, falling in love was compulsive. He really couldn't help himself, and lost a piece of his heart every time we stopped in a rest zone. This time, as always, he was ardently wooing a girl during our short periods of free time, and we all had to hear about it constantly. "You're driving us all up the wall with your tart," Lenson complained. "Why can't you just kiss and run like everybody else?" Lindbergh grinned. He was remembering his last outing with Lenson, Fairham and Solmer. The four of them had trapped a Polish woman of about 40 in a barn. She had yielded to their ardour, which had lasted the 4 hours remaining. "Her husband came home while we were at it," Solmer remembered joyfully. "He laughed with us and said, 'Mama too old for me now, for you.'" Later they'd all had a drink with the husband, who seemed perfectly content that they'd done him that service. "She's nothing but a sow, your Polska," Hals said. "And you're just a bunch of pigs. No poetry at all." The barracks shook with our laughter. Pastor Fairham laughed too, because he couldn't do anything else, but all the same he was somewhat troubled. Our company's love life was doing far too well. I myself didn't have any particular adventures. I had poured 1 or 2 girls, but matters had never progressed any further than that. Of course, I was in love with Paula and wrote to her often. Above all, I longed for a leave and lived on that hope. For the rest, strange bodies made me uneasy, almost sick. As soon as I saw naked flesh, I braced myself for a torrent of entrails, remembering countless wartime scenes, with smoking, stinking corpses pouring out their vitals. All things considered, I preferred platonic love by mail. To me, Paula was in an entirely separate category from all these other women, something delicate and marvellous which could not be eviscerated. Or so I tried to think. Then I was involved in an episode which gave everyone else a laugh at my expense. We were on leave at Sueca. It was a beautiful day, with only a light trace of frost. We all felt like a spree, but were also extremely interested in food. Our rations were now so small that we were always hungry when we left the mess halls. The peasants would usually sell us something to eat in exchange for the paper currency, which looked as though the Rentenbank was printing notes in excess of its reserves. We had, in fact, been given these notes as supplementary pay, in addition to the special tickets issued to occupation troops. Eggs were the easiest form of food to come by. At Sueca, we divided the job. There were 3 of us, Hoth, Schlesser and me. We had left Hals with his Polska at Nevotorecci. Nevotorecci was right beside the camp, and the soldiers had already stripped it of all extra food. We decided to go 3 miles farther, to Sueca, which was also on the Dniester, taking separate routes through the countryside to try our luck at the farmhouses whose location every man in the company had by heart. I set off along a road which ran downhill between 2 walls of snow. I can see it still. At the bottom of the hill there was a frozen pond which pink and yellow ducks were tapping with their bills, apparently mystified by its solidity. I turned to the right. Ahead of me were 2 low columns twined round with what looked like lifeless Virginia creeper, and beyond them an enormous pile of wood which almost hid the low thatched house. To the left, with their backs to the river, was a group of squat, irregular buildings made of rough wooden planks. The whole scene was inescapably rustic, but there was also a rudimentary sense of style, which was noticeable here even in the poorest, roughest setting. I was walking toward the cottage when I saw a woman coming from one of the outbuildings. Her clothes might have belonged to a medieval peasant. We both smiled. She said something unintelligible. "Guten Tag, Frau, I bitte." I was sure she wouldn't understand French, but she might very well know the German for egg. I bitte. She came closer, still smiling and pleasant, speaking and making gestures I couldn't understand. I contented myself with returning her smile. She signalled that I should follow her, which I did. We walked over to a ladder, and she began to climb, signing me to hold it steady. As she went up, laughing and talking, my eyes naturally followed her ascent toward a loft bulging with hay. My astonished gaze struck her rump, which was of very dubious charm, and a pair of enormous meaty thighs. Her buttocks seemed to fill the view with a curious obstinacy. Her drawers had the texture of a loosely knit sweater. I stared at them as I might have stared at some medieval monument of the 12th century. The Polska, who saw that I was watching, finally stopped by the false window of the loft and waved at me to follow her. I felt awkward and uneasy. I had often watched a tank trying to outmaneuver a machine gun, but this type of maneuver was beyond me. I was used to going straight ahead and climb the ladder as if it were an assault wall, which I had to scale under the eye of an officer. Then I was bent double in the piled-up hay beside the Polska, whose thighs must have been a half-yard round. She was laughing and clucking as if she herself were about to lay an egg. My gun caught on everything, and I felt once again as if I were crawling down a trench. The hay was full of chickens. The Polska chased them off and collected a few eggs. She turned back to me, still laughing. Her teeth were somewhat too widely spaced, but were dazzlingly white. She came toward me, holding out the warm eggs, which, in a manner of speaking, she had collected for me. I felt her breath and the warmth of her body. As she thrust the eggs and her hands deep into the pockets of my tunic, her fingers pressed against my hips. My startled eyes rolled in my head as I waited for the order to disengage. But the order didn't come, and the bold fingers of the enemy kneaded my flesh through the double folds of my pockets. "For the love of God! Danke schön! Danke schön!" I wanted to make the quickest possible departure no matter what she thought of me. She was now so close an embrace seemed inescapable. Her smile was one of certain anticipation, and her eyes were rolling feverishly. "Mein Gott!" I braced myself for her cry of "Ura Pobieda!" There were 2 possible courses of action, as I saw it. I could withdraw in a hurry and risk cracking my skull at the bottom of the ladder, or counterattack, rolling my adversary into the hay. However, these calculations came too late. The woman, who must have weighed at least 20 pounds more than I did, suddenly enlaced me, adroitly pushing me to the left so that I lost my balance. I found myself gesticulating in vain desperation beneath a massive enemy. One of her hands was already busy with the fly of my new synthetic trousers. The eggs in both pockets were broken, and my gun, which was slung behind my back, was no use to me. If the Führer ever saw me like that, I'd be thrown out of the Gross Deutschland for good, shipped off to one of the Brandenburg disciplinary battalions. To complete my downfall, my ravisher, who was clearly more accustomed to manipulating an axe handle than the personal appendage in question, had grabbed me and was making me jerk and shudder. To complete my downfall, my ravisher, who was clearly more accustomed to manipulating an axe handle than the personal appendage in question, had grabbed me and was making me jerk and shudder like an invalid with a severe case of hiccups. I might perhaps have been able to oblige her if the Polska, in the height of her frenzy, hadn't suddenly flung up her petticoats over the obese folds of her stomach and thighs. This spectacle destroyed the minimal desire my predicament might have aroused in me, and the delicious memory of Paula offered a contrast that was too absurd. With a brusque twist of my body, I freed myself from this female in rut, who was exciting herself without any cooperation from me. Her somewhat porcine face, in which a few moments before I might have found a certain charm, now wore an expression of bovine ecstasy. I stood up and turned out my pockets, which were filled with liquid egg and broken shell. My companion regained some measure of self-control and tried to laugh, suddenly afraid that her audacity might provoke severe consequences. In a flash, I was at the bottom of the ladder, gesturing to the woman to bring me something to clean off my jacket. I was worried about the consequences the stains on my uniform might bring down on me. I tried to look furious, but an overpowering sense of inadequacy made me flush hotly instead. The Polska, half smiling, half uneasy, led me over to the house. We went through a door which opened outward, down a few steps, and then through a second door which opened inward. The house was built into the ground to a depth of about 2.5 feet. We came into a dark, low-ceilinged room with a single tiny window, whose yellowish panes admitted very little light. The building was divided by a heavy wooden grate. One side was for people, the other for animals. This explained the fetid smell which I noticed as soon as the door was open. A couple of pigs were being fattened just beyond the grate. The wide benches built against the grate and covered with straw ticks were obviously the beds. An old woman turned toward us as we came in. She smiled with the indifference of a sphinx. I doubt if the idea of a German even existed for her. 2 children were playing on a woodpile which stood in the middle of the room. The Polska brought me some water in a wooden dipper, like the ones used in Russia for measuring millet. I had to take off my tunic and reveal the extent of my deprivation. The pullover my mother had sent me over a year and a half before no longer had any sleeves below the elbow, and the waistband had become a scant, lace-like fringe. I was preparing to wash my tunic when the Polska took it from me. She rubbed the stains between a round stone and a stiff straw implement shaped like a large cork. With a graciousness which almost excused her excesses of a few minutes earlier, she returned my tunic, which was clean once more. I didn't dare smile lest I rekindle her amorous fury. However, all of that seemed to have been forgotten. These Polish peasants seemed curiously primitive, living wholly in the present, unburdened by any thoughts of the past or the future. I said goodbye, thrusting out my stiffened arm in a regulation salute. While the old woman on the bench smiled, a smile which seemed to cross a gulf of several millennia, the younger one rummaged through a heap of cooking pots which stood on the table. She found an egg and held it out to me. I accepted it, not knowing what expression to put on to disguise my embarrassment. The egg recalled the loft of recent history. I could feel myself blushing as I went through my pockets for the correct change. However, the woman gestured to me that I need not pay. Still embarrassed, I withdrew in a flurry of Danke schöns. I had already taken a few strides away from the house when the door behind me opened again. The woman stood there calling me, holding out the gun which I had left propped against the table. How humiliating! I recovered myself with another sequence of voluminous thanks and, feeling ridiculous, straightened my back and tried to look stern, to make up for what had happened. I knew that this episode was destined to lighten the evening hours of these people and found it hard to forgive myself. What an idiot! To survive the Battle of Belgorod, only to get my pants torn off by a fat Polish mummer. I might be a proud member of a proud regiment, but all I had to show for it was a single egg, and an experience I wasn't going to disclose in a hurry, for fear my friends would rip off my pants again to make sure she hadn't stolen anything. "Why didn't you tell us right away?" they asked me later. "We would all have gone there and all insisted on it. Reprisals, you know." Spring burst out with sudden brutality. On the Eastern Front, things were going from bad to worse, but our training continued in the spirit of an athletic team preparing for a competition. Even more extraordinary, our schedule of exercises was markedly reduced, and we were often given free half-days. These were, in fact, necessary to give us time to forage and keep adequately fed. Our official rations had been cut back again, and now amounted to a starvation diet. The 2 villages closest to the camp had almost nothing left to give us, and we had to go farther afield in search of the calories which were largely consumed by our comings and goings. We took up fishing in the Dniester. Unfortunately, we had neither the proper equipment nor any local knowledge. 3 times Herr Hauptmann Vesreidau went with us. As an officer, he had appropriated a certain number of explosive devices, which made the operation profitable. Some pools produced giant fish. There was also an accident. 2 fellows who went out to look for food disappeared. Their friends said they'd gone toward the mountains. 2 days went by without any news of them. No one knew anything about them in the villages where we asked. It sounded like partisans. We sent out 2 search parties, which did in fact run into partisans, and suffered 5 stupid deaths without finding a trace of the missing men. While the Red Army pushed into Poland toward our camp, which would soon be in the battle zone, we lay in the sun as much as we could and waited for orders. Hals was daily more deeply in love, and spent as much time as he could with the girl he considered his fiancée. I often went with him, but never found a girl for myself. We had many pleasant times together, and Hals repeatedly told me that I must be due for a leave soon and would surely see Paula. Sometimes the 2 of them plainly wished to be alone, and I would take myself off. The war seemed to have forgotten us in this enchanted place. But one morning our tranquillity and dreams of love came to an end. The camp hummed with activity as companies packed up and prepared for action before our incredulous eyes. As motors hummed, the barracks were destroyed. Our amazement was complete. "What's going on?" "Los! Los! Schnell! We're clearing out!" Before we had quite realized it, we were loaded onto dull grey-blue trucks which bumped off to the north. In the beautiful fullness of germinating spring, the settled, organized camp went up in flames behind us. The convolutions of smoke rising into the pure, still air seemed like a sinister presage of things to come. In the trucks everyone was talking. What was happening? Why were they destroying the camp? Where was the front now, anyway? Toward 10 o'clock, the Gross Deutschland column suddenly stopped on a road dappled by the knobby shadows of branches loaded with thousands of buds bursting from the irresistible pressure of thousands of plump leaves still barely touched with green. The birds, as unprepared as we for what was coming, were singing and swooping down low over the trucks. A sidecar from Liaison delivered orders to the officer's Volkswagen. Then the non-coms told us to make a half-turn. Through the bursts of backfiring, we could hear the hum of a flight of planes. Then the whistles blew. "Achtung! Enemy planes coming for us! Achtung!" In a general rush, we jumped from the slowly moving trucks. In fact, the Ilyushin fighter bombers that had spotted us took their time. About 15 of them were turning in the sky, some 400 or 500 yards above us. Some trucks had been precipitately abandoned and were lying across the road. Our officers ran shouting at the drivers, who, caught between 2 fires, didn't know what to do. Finally, they jumped back into their machines, started them up again, and crashed them into the bank at the last possible moment as the flight of vultures swooped down on us. First, there were bombs, which we watched fall until the first explosions. They looked like fat darts with their long shafts, which allowed them to explode just above the ground. The planes had divided into 2 groups. The second unloaded at about the same spot as the first. The shock was extraordinarily violent. Everything flew into the air and fell onto our heads. An overturned truck flew toward us, stopping some 10 yards short of where we lay. The flames spread quickly in our direction, forcing us to move farther back. We no longer had any doubts about what was happening and ran as far as we could from the road, which was attacked again with rockets and machine guns. The running men, intent on getting away, hadn't noticed the second wave of planes, and were cut down by the machine gun fire, which passed over them like a pitiless reaper. Men were jolted off the ground as they ran, falling back again in pieces like puppets whose strings are broken. When the enemy withdrew, 18 of our machines were sending plumes of black smoke up into the sky. The attack had been so sudden and overwhelming that none of us quite grasped what had happened. We returned to the scene of the disaster with one eye on the sky. The enemy might only have pretended to leave and might still be waiting to attack us again. The road, still gluey from the recent thaw and the spring rains, was strewn with debris and shattered bodies. The violence of the impact had smashed some of the victims wide open, scattering their entrails over distances of 7 or 8 yards. The peaceful roadway, which had been filled with the sounds of twittering birds only 15 minutes before, looked defiled. Within 15 minutes, our column, made up of 30 trucks transporting 3 companies, had lost 20 men and 18 trucks. There were also 3 wounded men in critical condition. We collected the remains of our dead and dug graves. Among the victims were Hoth and Dunder, who had both received Iron Crosses for their bravery on the Second Dnieper front. They were both friends with whom we had been laughing and joking barely 24 hours before. After the event, the tragic impact of what had happened crushed and overwhelmed us. We piled onto the remaining trucks, which seemed to buckle under the extra weight. There were men on the running boards, fenders, hoods and bumpers. Budding twigs clung to these human swarms, bumping forward at 25 miles per hour. 2 of the trucks quickly died under the extra load, and the men they carried had to continue on foot. They joined us 6 hours later, on the Romanian frontier, as we were getting ready to join the carnage at Vinnitsa, between the central front, which had been broken, and the southern front, which still seemed to be holding. On the way, these men had been attacked by Russo-Polish partisans. However, they were fortunately able to turn the encounter to their own advantage. They had taken the partisans' horses and a few more still left on neighbouring farms, and had joined us looking like an apparition of chivalric fantasy. The weather was warm and sunny. We were returning to Russia just after the period of melting ice. We requisitioned a few Romanian trucks which had been left for civilian use to replace the ones destroyed in the attack. These were old machines, bearing the names of private firms, which we didn't have time to paint out. Our section drove off in an English moving van, which must have left the factory sometime around 1930. After a rushed, jolting journey, we re-entered the Ukraine, where the ground had not yet entirely absorbed the spring runoff. There were long stretches of gluey mud, which we were able to cross only with great difficulty. The weather was beautiful, even hot, and we often stripped to the waist. On the road, we received new orders. We were no longer to proceed to Vinnitsa. Instead, we were to re-establish communications between the rear and the front, which were continually harassed by partisans. We were ordered to annihilate these bands. Their attacks had grown increasingly virulent and often paralysed the already uncertain flow of supplies. The Vinnitsa bridgehead had to be maintained as a starting point for new German offensives that would break up the wedge the Russians had driven into Poland before Lvov and re-establish a connection with the north, which appeared to be holding. Our detachments, together with other units, had been given the job of engaging the partisans in a contest of ambush in which the advantage belonged to whichever side surprised the other. Once again, the division was broken up. The largest section was sent to fight north of Lvov and in the northern sector of White Russia. Other units like ours were scattered throughout the rear areas of the south and central sectors before rejoining the division a few weeks later. Our zone of operations extended through Bessarabia as far as the Russian frontier. As before, we were a strong mobile unit designed to move quickly to the support of particular points in imminent danger. However, our mobility depended on the vehicles I have already described, which we gradually abandoned, continuing on horseback or on bicycles, whose tyres were often stuffed with grass. We requisitioned the horses, bicycles and other vehicles from the thousands of refugees, Ukrainians, gypsies, Polish colonists and others, who were fleeing the red tide in a vast throng. Sometimes partisans infiltrated these crowds, posing as simple peasants who were also fleeing the Bolsheviks. Then, at a given moment, they would shoot some of our men in the back, sowing general confusion. These manoeuvres were supposed to crack our self-control and provoke us to acts of reprisal, which would then turn the refugees against us. From their point of view, any means were justified. Toward the end of May, we trapped a large band of rebels in a piece of wooded country. There were about 400 heavily armed men. On our side, we had 3 companies to draw in the noose around the enemy. The air was filled with woodland smells, and nothing seemed appropriate to the bloody events about to occur. The morning was splendid. Birds and small animals of every kind were running and fluttering through the branches to get out of our way. Wild animals, even ferocious ones, always flee armed men. This time the hunters were tracking far more dangerous game. The birds fearing and fleeing us could never have imagined that the masters of the world, who should have feared nothing, had created enemies of a size and ferocity which equalled their own. Human beings, rulers of the animal world, had created their own destruction. A process of natural selection, often very badly organized, periodically topples our crown. We all felt extremely nervous. Despite the resignation which had once again taken hold of us, the moment of truth has always revealed who was afraid, who was a coward, and who still hoped to live. The soft leaves brushing against our heads, weighted down with steel, reminded us that life could be good, especially in such marvellous weather. For us, this was no baptism of fire, but almost a routine, a dangerous routine, in which medals for heroism were generally posthumous. We had already experienced most of its horrors, and had seen the upturned eyes of those who had won the medals. There was no longer much we could learn about that aspect of things. We deliberately maintained an attitude of morbid fatalism, which we punctuated with bursts of harsh, forced laughter, like machine-gun fire. Some of the very strong had even managed to persuade themselves that since no man is immortal and everyone dies sooner or later, the hour of death was unimportant. Those men, the strong ones, walked along thinking of other things. Others strong, but not that strong, lived to delay that final moment, watching through pupils as dark as the holes at the ends of their gun barrels. The rest, which is to say the majority, were pouring with a cold sweat that ran down their bodies beneath their synthetic tunics, into their boots, and into the creases of their damp hands. Those men were afraid, with an intense fear that reduced every conviction to nothing, and which no routine could soften. They were afraid before every operation, when time seemed to stand almost still. Even those who managed to stop thinking were still assailed by fear, as persistent as the daylight which illuminates treetops one is still unaware of. Contact with the enemy puts an end to this sort of fear. The opening shots raise the curtain on a drama which will fully occupy every sense. It is a pity that soldiers can think. When the first men have fallen, the tension slackens, and no one any longer pays attention to anything except the dry twigs crackling underfoot. Feldwebel Spurlowski, who was leading our group, pointed to the signs of passage of a large number of men. The heavily trampled brush and the numerous empty gun emplacements indicated that we were approaching a large partisan camp. We had to watch carefully for mines, to watch each step, in addition to everything else. Sweat trickled down our temples, attracting clouds of belligerent flies. The brush under the trees and the low branches offered 1,000 opportunities for concealed tripwires. Every yard required desperate concentration. A plane passed over level with the treetops, and the throb of its engines made us all hold our breaths for fear the vibrations might be enough to set off the whole area. At last there was a short blast on the whistle, and we all fell flat. A small fort of logs driven deep into the ground stood at the end of a vague footpath. At the far end of our group, fighting had already begun. Spurlowski designated 2 men, Ballers and Prince, to throw grenades at the fort. Prince was one of the men in Lenson's Panzerfaust team. Today, however, the anti-tank group wasn't needed, so Prince was just another panzer grenadier, panting as he crawled forward with his lethal burden. Ballers, more dead than alive, was crawling along the other side of the path, identically laden. We all watched, trembling with tension. Who were Ballers and Prince? 2 men from anywhere. Were they good men or bad? Were they hateful? Was God with them, or had he condemned them? They were simply two men who had become our comrades in this group of madmen, men whose acquaintance we would probably have avoided in the ordinary circumstances of civilian life. Here, every step they took accelerated the beating of our hearts and keyed up our pulse rate to equal theirs. Those two anonymous beings, both of them our men, were suddenly more important to every one of us than even our closest relatives, an egotistical transformation in which we all knew that we saw ourselves. Had the circumstances fallen slightly differently, they would have been watching us. Motive seemed totally unimportant, if only they lived. They were already quite far from us, and perhaps very close to death, hidden from many of us by leaves. I could still see them. Prince suddenly stood up and heaved his load towards the log fort. Then he plunged down again. The entire woods felt the violence of the explosion. Its thunder echoed interminably under the trees. In the patches of sky visible through the branches, we could see the birds shooting away from us like arrows. Prince's bundle had fallen short and had made a large crater crowned with broken branches some 7 or 8 meters from the partisan hideout. "Scheisse," muttered our sergeant. "There's nobody there," someone else said. Then I saw Ballers running forward in turn. As he ran, I felt myself dying in his shoes. He too threw his packet of explosives and then dived down as the trees all around us bent against a flash of light. The forest seemed to groan with the shock. This time there weren't any fleeing birds, only our mimetic uniforms, which confounded us with nature. Ballers had just stood up again. So had Prince, a short distance ahead of him. Their figures were sharply outlined against the broken earth. Behind them, all that had formerly been visible of the fort had disappeared. "This way, comrades!" shouted Ballers, proud of his exploit. "There's nobody in there!" We all stood up, prepared to join him. He was laughing nervously. A crisp detonation whistled through the leaves, followed by 2 more. Prince was running toward us, but Ballers wasn't. He was walking hesitantly, stretching one hand toward us. Then he fell. A short hour later, 400 partisans were fighting like devils inside the circle we had drawn around them and were slowly tightening. 3 companies almost at full strength, about 800 or 900 men, were trying to knock out the circle of fire, which was produced by a variety of weapons of every caliber and amounted to a serious destructive force. The partisan position was so well organized that any approach to it was almost suicidal. During this hour, 2 of our men stepped on mines, and their shattered bodies were blown into the budding branches. We were under uninterrupted fire from a 4-barreled machine gun, and setting up a Spandau was very risky. We tried to dig foxholes, but the earth was such a tangle of ineradicable roots that our position of attack was transformed into one of defence, which would be difficult to hold against an enemy breakout. Only our light mortars, with their almost vertical fire, could touch the enemy position. Unfortunately, the partisans seemed able to absorb our fire without any apparent loss of strength. 2 or 3 heavy howitzers, probably captured German equipment, were firing at our encircling forces, with the impact of the projectiles uprooting trees. The discharge of these guns was invisible, making their destruction extremely difficult. 10 times we sent assault groups to attack the position. Each time they had to retreat, leaving some of their men screaming on the ground. Later we learned that Wesredo had been trying desperately to get some armoured and motorised support, but none was available in the area, and we had to manage without it. Everything that remained had been sent to support our crumbling front. After an hour of waiting and fruitless assaults, our commander decided to risk everything once and for all. Leaving only a handful of men to maintain the illusion of a strong force around the fort, he shifted the rest of us, taking every precaution, so the enemy would believe they were still surrounded. This allowed him to mass 500 men and send them all at once against the enemy's weakest point, a V-shaped trench held by 40 men armed with rifles and 1 machine gun. At his order, 500 men charged the enemy position, attacking with grenade throwers. The enemy reeled under this force and was unable to maintain accurate fire. 7 or 8 of our men fell during this assault, but the maneuver was so successful that for the moment no one paid much attention to them. I was part of the second wave, followed by two others. By the time we reached the enemy position, the job was already done. About 40 partisans had tried to resist, but our grenades annihilated 2/3 of them. The remainder died on the bayonets of the first Germans to reach the fortress. We followed closely, with another wave right behind us. The underbrush rang with hideous screams and smelled of powder, smoke, and blood. I saw more partisans emerging from their log fort, firing point blank at our men, who were exhilarated by the success of our action. In the general confusion, I opened fire along with everyone else. A tall Russian fired at me 3 times without hitting me, although I made no effort to dodge. Then he rushed at me, shouting and waving his gun. 2 of our men joined me and fired at him. He fell and tried to reload his gun, but we jumped him immediately, battering him with our butts until he died under our blows. At the foot of the blockhouse, a desperate hand-to-hand struggle was in progress. Something exploded amid the fighting, sending shattered fragments of German and partisan bodies flying. Other men ran up to continue the fight, surrounded by the dead and dying. Cries and curses mingled with the sharp crack of rifle fire. A moment later, we were in the thick of it. One of the men with me had his arm broken by an exploding mine. Pressed against the wooden wall, men fought hand-to-hand with knives, shovels, feet, and stones. An Obergefreiter had just hit a Russian in the face with his shovel, opening a hideous gash. The wounded man fell writhing to the ground. Kellerman was firing in short bursts at the partisans hidden behind the 2 howitzers that had troubled us so much. Many Russians escaped, at least half of them. Those who couldn't added to the numbers of the dead. We collected all the stray guns and food reserves, destroyed the howitzers, which we couldn't take with us, and buried 70 of our men. Then we left, carrying out the wounded on stretchers made of branches. In the evening we arrived at a kolkhoz, where we drank everything we could get, trying to blot out the memory of a hideous day. Spring in the Ukraine, endless days of almost unbroken light. A luminous darkness fell toward 11 at night, yielding to a pink dawn a few hours later. The weather was perfect, a warm, reviving wind before the crushing heat of summer. Unfortunately, although the season made us dream of peace, the monster of war had emerged from the paralysis of winter and the thaw. The pale blue sky belonged to the Russians, whose air power had grown enormously. The Luftwaffe, whose numbers had been seriously reduced by the need to defend German cities and address the increasing demands of the Western Front, flew daily sorties that amounted to suicide flights against overwhelming enemy strength both on the ground and in the air. Our few victories were the product of absolute heroism. The sky and the front belonged to the enemy. The rear areas were contested by 2 nearly equal opponents, the German army and the partisans. We continually sent out patrols, almost every sortie resulting in a clash. Every hill, hedge, and cottage hid a mine or an ambush. We had almost no vehicles, no gas, and no spare parts. We were not receiving any fresh supplies. The odd, ill-assorted convoys still pressing through continuous air attacks were not destined for us, but for the faltering, collapsing front. When they arrived in the forward zone, they could find the correct units only by accident. More often than not, their cargoes were absorbed by the hordes of starving men retreating under a deluge of fire. We received, at the greatest risk, about 1/10 of what we needed. We were obliged to live off the local inhabitants, who were very hard-pressed themselves and more than reluctant in their attitude toward us. The food situation had become extremely serious. As it was spring, there were still very few fruits, and hunting was more dangerous for us than for the game. A small hamlet sheltered what remained of our 3 companies. Between operations, men slept almost naked on the ground. "Those who sleep dine," says the proverb. For us, it was vitally important that this became the reality. When planes flew over, everyone took cover, and when they were gone, we lay out in the sun again. This helped to heal our winter louse bites. Half asleep, with our eyes half closed, we stared into the sky, apparently thinking of nothing. What was the use? We seemed to have completely broken with the past. Memories of peace floated up like fragments of books we might have read. The war had taught us to appreciate every small good. Today, the sun replaced our goulash, wurst, millet, and the mail that no longer came. We lay stretched on the Ukrainian soil, apparently calm and at peace. Tomorrow, perhaps, some food would arrive, perhaps some gas and some spare parts, perhaps even some mail, a letter from Paula. But perhaps there would only be ourselves, the earth, the sky, and the sun. What was the use of thinking about it? One day our radio crackled with an SOS from a territorial post on the Romanian frontier. It was surrounded by a band of partisans. The Wehrmacht still officially considered us part of a motorized unit on standby and therefore available. As a result, we were always moving and had to be ready to leave at a moment's notice for points within a radius of 150 miles. The post calling us was about 100 miles away and had appealed to us because its officers had been told they could rely on our mobility in emergencies. In fact, we had 4 trucks in bad condition, a small civilian van, a sidecar, and the COS Steiner. Wesreidau tore his hair and cursed. As quickly as possible, 100 of us left to answer the SOS, taking as many automatic weapons as we could to make up for our small number. Each truck carried 2 Spandaus ready to fire. Above all, we feared planes. We drove as quickly as possible along the terrible Russian roads, raising a thick cloud of dust. About 30 miles from our starting point, we hurtled through a village that could have belonged to prehistory. The inhabitants ran as fast as they could to get out of our way. We were bristling with weapons and black with dust, and we must have looked far from reassuring. As we left the village, a group of terrified residents scattered ahead of us. The Steiner went through, and then the first truck, which crushed a dog. The second truck bumped a black pig that ran out from nowhere and threw itself under the wheels. I was in the third truck and saw the whole sequence: the sudden braking ahead, the shrieking villagers running to the side of the road, the screaming pig dragging itself through the dust. 5 or 6 Lancer jumped off the truck to chase the pig, trying to kill it as it squealed in agony. Finally, they stabbed it with their bayonets. It was still kicking, spattering its executioners with blood, as they tied its feet with belts and ropes and hung its 150 pounds from the tailgate of their truck. Then we started off again to catch up with the others, leaving the village in a squeal of gears. The pig, too, was soon covered with dust, which mingled with its streaming blood. We no longer objected to details like that. For those who survived, there would be fresh meat this evening. Sieg Heil. We were now driving through a strange landscape of smooth black hills, almost like enormous boulders, scattered with a few stunted trees. Wherever the ground was broken, the soil was black and seemed as hard as stone. I wished I knew something about geology. Our route took us through this curious terrain for about 15 miles. We had just left that strange district when a group of planes was reported. One of our spotters confirmed that he had seen them through the treetops, slightly to our left. Our trucks pulled over to the side of the road, where they were screened by leaves. Wesreidau stared at the sky through his field glasses, but couldn't see anything. It seemed wise to wait for a few minutes. The Lancer in the third truck put the time to good use, slitting open the pig and disposing of its guts with lightning speed. As the job wasn't quite finished when we started out again, they finished it on the back of the truck. A few miles farther on, as we bumped through a chaotic landscape, 2 planes came over very low. We shouted at the drivers, who jammed on the brakes. There were no thick trees nearby. As the planes passed directly overhead, we were all gripped by an insane, hopeless panic. Some men wet their pants. As the planes vanished into the distance, we lifted our heads and saw 2 Me-109Fs, which must have been the survivors of some squadron. No one thought of cheering the Luftwaffe. We had all been too afraid. Toward 4, we approached the zone of operations. Our trucks followed a winding track through mountainous country, driving very slowly for fear of ambush. Wesreidau's Steiner was in the lead. 2 observers, hunched on the hood, kept their eyes riveted on the dust along the way and the heights surrounding us. Nothing we could see was reassuring. Suddenly, we looked down into an open valley. We stopped, cutting off our engines, and immediately heard the distant sound of machine guns. Without a doubt, we had arrived. In the distance, through the heat haze, we could see what looked like a village. We kept the trucks 100 yards apart and maintained a moderate speed as the men clung onto the railings. Once again, our stomachs clenched at the approach of danger, and we wondered when we would begin to be adult men. Naturally, the enemy knew we were coming. The first truck suddenly saw the commander's Steiner driving backward at breakneck speed from a turn in the road. The vehicle was rolling down a slope when a sharp explosion burst on the track some 10 yards ahead of it. Everyone plunged to the ground, and the trucks took whatever shelter they could. A second explosion tore a hole in the road, lifting a large cloud of dust. They were plastering us with shells from a 37mm gun. Then a burst of machine gun fire riddled the first truck. Luckily, everyone was already out. The driver must have been watching in a cold sweat. The enemy was hidden by the undulations of the country and was very hard to see. Nonetheless, the men in the Steiner knew they'd been lucky. It was miraculous that the 37mm gun hidden behind the trees to the right of the turn hadn't opened fire the moment the Steiner appeared. The partisans had felled a tree across the road right after the turn. We set up 2 light mortars and shelled the enemy gun, which soon fell silent. "Probably amateurs," Wes Riedel remarked. We deployed a dozen FMs, which made movement very difficult for the partisans firing from the mountainside. Our group slid through the brush and climbed the first rocky outcrops, while our mortars rained a hail of projectiles, more terrifying than destructive, onto any point that seemed to harbour opposition. We had just uncovered an enemy post, real Johnny-come-latelys giving Fritz a hard time to reap a reward from their grateful country. "What bastards!" muttered Prince to Smellens. "Coming to shoot at us just for the hell of it. We'll fix them." Our group attacked the partisans with grenade throwers. In that enclosed bowl of hills, the explosions made an overwhelming noise. Then someone raked the edges of the enemy ambush with a Spandau, which we recognized by the sound of its fire. After 2 more grenades, the apprentice sharpshooters were ready to give up. A figure ran out, attempting a desperate flight. He was quickly cut down by the Spandau. "What a bastard!" Prince shouted. "It's horrible to shoot down idiots like that. Why can't they stay home and wait until the war ends, for the love of God? If I was in their shoes, no one could twist my arm. And you'd be the same, wouldn't you, Sager?" "Home!" The thought went to my head like a gulp of wine. Home, to wait for the war to end. "Yes," I said finally. "And now we have to shoot them," he said. "It's disgusting." We could hear plaintive cries from the enemy entrenchment. To our left, Spandaus and grenade throwers were destroying the tranquility of the spring. Suddenly one of the Russian boys, in an excess of zeal, stood up, exposing half his body, and raked us with a burst of machine gun fire. His loose, approximate fire wounded one of our men in the right hand, and then another, undoubtedly from a ricochet, in the calf. The Russian was shot down by our Spandau, while our wounded man began to groan in a shaded corner. "God damn it!" someone shouted. "Will you stop this bullshit?" 2 figures climbed from the partisan position and, without any apparent hurry, began to run. Our FM sent them rolling in the dust too. "Did you see that?" Smellens said to the gunner. "You just got a girl." "A girl? Are you sure? If women are getting mixed up in this mess now, that's the last straw." A few minutes later we counted the bodies of the partisans, 6 young people about our age. Among them were 2 pretty girls, bathed in blood and covered with a swarm of blue flies. We stared down at our victims, sickened by the sight. Why had they thrown themselves across the route of our misery? Their amateur barrier was quickly dismantled. We cleared the road and marched to the village. The trucks followed slowly behind us. Had the enemy been misinformed? Had they received exaggerated estimates of our minuscule capacity? Were they afraid? Whatever the reason, they abandoned their grip on the post, which was almost theirs, and came out to meet us. The sun was shining brightly on the narrow, dusty road. At the head of the column, our men were in contact with the enemy, who had taken refuge in the town cemetery. It was a typical Russian cemetery, blue and gold and white, with no suggestion of sadness about it. The day was perfect, with late June spring turning into summer. We could almost have been fighting for a lark. Each plume of smoke was immediately carried away by a gentle breeze. We would certainly have been satisfied with a light exchange of fire, but our commander saw things differently. We couldn't let the enemy think we were too weak to attack. So our grenade throwers and light mortars destroyed the blue cemetery. 2 groups chased the partisans out and occupied the cemetery gardens. The partisans had taken refuge in a nearby wooden building where the crops were stored. On the door, the enemy had daubed the Marxist slogan, "Workers of the world, unite." This hasty scrawl, with dripping letters, gave a tearful impression of Marxist beliefs. To dispose of this flimsy, improvised fortress quickly, we loaded the Spandau with explosive incendiary bullets. The thatched roof caught fire almost at once. The enemy, defending themselves with automatic weapons, did not spare their fire. A salvo of mortar shells knocked the roof into the building, and the partisans had to abandon their untenable position. Our 2 groups ran toward the burning building to harass the Russians as they fled. An old bearded man was leaning against a pile of stones, shouting curses at us. His right hand rested on the head of a dead comrade lying on the ground beside him. The old man was wounded himself, and his clothes were torn and burned. We walked past him at a distance of no more than 3 yards. The sight of our guns didn't silence him. He shook his fist at us and cursed us. We all saw him through the smoke and sparks of the burning barn, but no one thought of shooting him. He showered maledictions at us until the collapse of the building buried him. A column of sparks rose into the azure sky. The first elements of our group were already in the village streets, firing on anything that moved. The last of the partisans were running toward the mountains. For a moment they were directly exposed to our fire, and we shot down 20 of them on the dusty road and among the junipers on the hillside. The Spandau, fitted with a special magazine, took a terrible toll on the fleeing groups of partisans. Then we stopped firing, and the men from the German post came out and joined us. Many were wounded, and 12 were dead. We gave the wounded first aid and drove the local residents from their huts. Fires were spreading everywhere and had to be put out. Men, women, and children joined us in fighting the flames. It took almost an hour to extinguish them. Then everyone, ourselves included, dragged the bodies of the dead to a central point. Women screamed and cried as they recognized a husband, son, or lover. It seemed most of the partisans had lived in this place. Soon, however, tears and sobs turned into threats and curses. We collected our own dead and wounded with the usual mute sentiment established by habit. The day was so beautiful it was hard to believe any of this was really serious. Our eyes, disillusioned by so much accumulated fear and anxiety, no longer distinguished the tragedies of any particular moment. Hals stared at the magnificent mountain scenery as he carried a comrade whose tunic was blotched with brown stains. The birds had regained their sense of spring joy and were flying once again through the blue sky, faintly marked by smoke from the smouldering fires. For us in the Eastern armies, this joyousness of nature almost excused what had just happened. After the mud and the cold, we were like wild animals, overjoyed by the spring sun and the knowledge that shelter for the night was no longer a serious problem. We deplored what had just happened as a disturbance of the peace and quiet we so much appreciated. The villagers were still caught in a crisis of tearful despair, and insults, which were comprehensible simply by their tone, shook our sense of well-being. Someone threw a stone, which hit one of our wounded men in the face. 2 Lancer spun around, brandishing their machine guns. "Break it up, you pigs, or we'll drill you full of holes!" But the shouted curses continued. We were ringed by faces, especially feminine faces, distorted by rage, spitting and cursing and shaking fists. Suddenly, 6 planes flying wing to wing appeared in that marvelous sky. 6 Soviet fighters, looking for one of our convoys. This sign heartened the Russians, who shouted, "Ura Stalin!" and pointed at the planes, which blindly continued their search. We could see such hatred on all these faces that we shivered despite the fine spring day. We were all thinking of our tortured, mutilated comrades, murdered by men who were mixing themselves into a fight that had left them on the sidelines. We remembered once again the tragic deaths at the territorial posts all along our line of retreat during the winter, faces smashed open with axes so that the gold teeth could be pulled out, the hideous agony of wounded men tied with their heads inside the gaping bellies of dead comrades, amputated genitals, Ella's section, whom we had found tied up and naked on a day when the temperature had dropped to 30 degrees below zero, with their feet thrust into a drinking trough which had frozen solid, and the faces of tortured men under the dark winter sky. With dry mouths, we listened to the mounting rage of these peasants, who were now paying a price they could have avoided for all time. If anyone had ordered us to fire, we would have obeyed without hesitation. I could see the gun shaking in the filthy, nervous hands of the man nearest me. A little way off, another of our men was no longer able to control the trembling of his face muscles. We had all stopped working, and our anger was rising like a storm. A tall, slim figure strode between the two groups. We saw that it was Wesredow, and that he was white with fury. He stopped 5 yards from the Russians and threw them a look so terrible that silence fell at once. He had learned Russian during the long course of the campaign. He told the villagers to bury their dead with the same silence and respect he required of his troops. He said that the war would soon be over for them, and that they should wait for the end, keeping to the sidelines. He said that he had never imagined the war would bring him to shoot civilians who had been misled into arming by false propaganda, and excused himself for what he had been forced to do. Then his voice became as hard as death. He said he would not tolerate any further hostile manifestations, that he intended to return to camp with all his men still alive, and that the entire village would be held responsible if he did not. Wesredow's words had the effect of a soothing balm. Everything returned to a state of unexpected order. The dead were buried, and sobs were stifled. We found enough gas for our return in the stores of the outpost. The men there entertained us with a few bottles they had put aside several months before. Then we returned to the road, leaving 8 wounded men behind at the post, where the medical service would pick them up the next day. 6 others failed to answer the roll call and remained in the Ukrainian soil forever. "Not so crowded this time," someone said. We acquiesced without speaking. Our eyes lingered on the village disappearing behind clouds of dust raised by the trucks. The beautiful spring light glowed all around our blackened, steel-capped faces, which seemed irrevocably cut off from the season. Our awareness of everything was similarly split. Our thoughts, like our eyes, couldn't settle on anything that seemed definite or restful, and a sense of well-being had no place in the convoy. The whirling dust hid the bursting spring. All we could see were the trucks and the grotesque dangling cadaver of the pig, covered with blood and flies. The trucks lurched along the narrow mountain road, whose illogical course might have been traced by some wandering goat. Obstacles like stone outcrops were included without modification, and natural shaded ridges were avoided. Sometimes the track plunged into the bed of an unexpected stream or through a temporary pond. At other times we crossed deserts of dust, where the dryness seemed eternal. The trucks slowly pursued the twists and turns, carrying us along, penned between the rattling railings. We seemed to be wandering endlessly toward new horizons on which we never had time to gaze, through an oversized, over-intense spring which would not allow us to forget that we were at war. Our expressionless faces stared at the spring with the unhappiness of paupers staring into a shop window decorated for Christmas. We too wanted the war to stop and dreamed of peace, like the seriously ill for whom the first sight of spring buds kindles a spark of life. But the fighting didn't stop. There was never more than a semblance of peace, and always someone to fan the flames of war. These people, on both sides, perhaps had perfectly good reasons for what they did. On that day, one of them crossed the road as we climbed up the long slope. He had seen us coming and quickly, perhaps inside of 10 minutes, laid his trap, hiding it in one of the dozens of potholes that pitted the surface. Then he hid, perhaps waiting to see what happened. Perhaps he too saw the yellow flash that tore apart our lead car. As always, there was a loud noise and a great deal of smoke climbing in black plumes toward the desperately smiling sky. 6 blood-stained men were slowly dying in the shadows of those plumes. The front of the Steiner was gone. The rest of the machine was knocked over onto its side. A few men pulled the victims from the flaming wreckage, while the rest assumed a defensive position. We laid Wesredau and the 5 other occupants of the car against the bank of red earth. 2 of them were already dead. Another had a leg torn open in several places by metal fragments. His thigh looked like a millefeuille pastry. Wesredau was covered with wounds, and his body seemed to be broken by multiple fractures. We did everything we could for him. The whole company thought of him as a friend. With everyone helping, we managed to bring him back to consciousness. Unlike everyone else we had watched, our captain did not have a face twisted by the revulsion or agony of death. His swollen face even managed to smile. We thought we had saved him. In a very weak voice, he spoke to us of our collective adventure, stressing our unity, which must hold in the face of everything to come. He pointed to one of his pockets, from which Feldwebel Spolowski pulled an envelope, undoubtedly addressed to his family. After that, for nearly a minute, we watched our chief die. Our faces, used to such spectacles, remained impassive, but the silence was terrible. We were able to save 2 of the men from the car, loading them carefully onto the vehicles that remained. Lieutenant Vollers took command and organized a decent burial for our venerated leader. We walked past his grave one by one, saluting. We felt that we had just lost the man on whom the well-being of the whole company depended. We felt abandoned. That night we returned to the isolated village where our comrades were anxiously waiting for our return. The announcement of our commander's death provoked stupefied consternation. We were all in danger of death, but the annihilation of Wesredau seemed as impossible to us as life without their parents seems to small children. We were prepared for every other death, but no one was ready to concede that fate for our leader. Guard duty that night seemed more uncertain than before. Our 3 companies seemed more vulnerable than ever. We all turned toward a source of strength that remained silent. Who would our new leader be? On whom would the destiny of our group depend? At the first light of dawn, after our radio message had reached headquarters, a DO-217 flew over, releasing a smoke signal. This told us that our 3 motorized companies should proceed quickly to a key position at the front, to the north of us. We were ordered to destroy our base and most of the village. Nothing should be left which would aid or shelter the enemy. As we had no incendiary material, we limited ourselves to burning the thatched roofs of the cottages. Then our motorized company left on foot, with our materiel loaded into the 4 ancient trucks we had left. The radio truck and sidecar preceded them. Every 10 or 15 miles, the trucks and sidecar stopped and waited for us. We would arrive at the front together, or not at all. Our orders made no sense. The officers issuing them seemed to be completely unaware of the actual condition of mobile units allegedly standing by. We were limited to doing the best we could. Food was our most difficult problem. For a long time now we had received no supplies, and our meals were produced by some kind of magic. We became hunters and trappers and nest robbers, and experimented with wild plants whose leaves looked like salad greens. After a long chase, we were sometimes able to catch an abandoned horse. But 800 men require substantial quantities of food, and every day we were faced with the same difficulties. Every day we called for help on the radio, and every day received the same reply: "Supplies en route should have reached you." The Army Postal Service seemed to have vanished too. No letters or packages, no news of any kind. Despite the warm summer sun, which was now in fact somewhat too warm, the situation had become desperate. Yesterday's pig had been grilled and boiled and devoured the night before, along with 150 quarts of hot water, which we elevated to the status of pork bouillon. Today we were leaving for the front. Our eyes gleamed, like the eyes of famished wolves. Our stomachs were empty, our mess tins were empty, and the horizon was devoid of any hope. Murderous sentiments lurked behind our eyes, which glittered with hunger. Hunger produces a curious frame of mind. It is impossible to imagine dying of hunger. For a long time now, we had been used to living on very little. Our stomachs digested substances which would kill a comfortable bourgeois citizen in a few weeks. No one had any spare fat left, no bellies or double chins, and our long muscles stood out in relief, as though we'd been flayed. As our fast continued, our senses grew more acute. We looked like the bony animals with blazing eyes one might encounter in the desert. It would take days of marching and dust to extinguish that blaze. For the moment, despite the hollows in our bellies, everything still seemed possible. We would simply march until we found food. After all, Russia was not an empty desert. The immense prairie around us looked fertile, and we would surely come across a village we could ransack. Spurlovsky and Lenson checked the map. There were a great many villages in our sector, therefore the situation wasn't too serious. The trouble was that our rectangle of paper represented an area as large as all of France. Between any two villages there might be hundreds of absolutely empty miles. The smallest digression to reach one of the names on the map could mean several more days of marching. "There's nothing really to worry about," said Lenson, who didn't like to concede defeat. "There are plenty of villages lost in the steppe which aren't marked on the map, and then there are the kolkhozes too. We had been ordered to march north. There could be no more delay. In any case, there was nothing left to eat where we were. Our long file set out. Compagnie, marche, marche! Hour after hour, at 2 or 3 miles an hour, we tramped in growing desperation through the uncultivated prairie. "Somebody could make money farming here," remarked a Hanover country boy. There were large fields of wheat near each village. Beyond these, over spaces as broad as a French department, there was nothing but wild grass and grey or red dust and thick forest, much of which was probably virgin. We had grown used to great distances. Above all, we thought of them as possible battlefields. Other reactions still lay in the future for those who returned to their native countries, with their suffocating densities and horizons which seemed close enough to touch, always marked by commonplace structures of public utility, stones arranged in some dubious style. These men, who had grown used to stretches of ground as vast as the sky, no longer knew how to sit on grass which always belonged to someone. For us, at the moment, there was only limitless space, where our boots raised a cloud of multicoloured dust that settled on everything that disturbed it. We belonged to the earth far more than it belonged to us. Except for the war, we felt a vast, limitless pleasure in our surroundings, in a kind of plenitude for which in later years we would always feel nostalgia. If only there had been something to eat. After our 11 o'clock break, our march began again. We had gulped down like a dose of medicine the cooked sprouts of young wheat, which had been prepared 2 days earlier. As a last resort, we had some millet cooked in water. The weather was very hot. Fortunately, our exceedingly light meals did not produce after-dinner somnolence. We drank the warm water from our water bottles with a certain apprehension. Running streams were quite widely spaced, and water from ponds carried the risk of malaria, typhoid, and other diseases, like cholera. To keep up our spirits, we sang as we marched, "Ein Heller and ein Batzen." The words, like the tune, were carried into the emptiness by the light summer wind, losing all meaning, which no longer seemed strange to ears once accustomed to hearing them echo between the walls of flag-decked towns. Der Heller ward zu Wasser, der Batzen ward zu Wein not, that we had any choice. There was no wine, and the water had to be drunk sparingly and with caution. "Heidi, Heido, Haida, Heidi, Heido, Haida, Heidi, Heido, Haida. Compagnie, marche, marche." We marched, singing for no one but ourselves, and all of us already knew the tune. Then it grew dark. Darkness fell very late on our bivouac and across the plain, on which it seemed we had hardly moved, on our dust-covered faces and aching muscles. We were already asleep on our feet. The silence seemed to have a special quality, as though it had come from the end of the world. At daybreak our march resumed. For hours the long row of hills on the horizon seemed to remain at the same distance from us. We were walking through a rocky plain where the highest rise in the ground was scarcely the height of a man. Small stands of trees, which reminded me of photographs of Africa, were scattered across the landscape. The trees were short and scrubby, curiously like the trees of high altitudes. The wind blew the red dust everywhere, as if we were tramping through a universe of powdered brick. For a long time now we had given up marching in threes, the regulation order for marching troops, in favour of the system used by partisans. We were broken up into more or less compact groups, in which a man was ahead only until someone else caught up with him. Everyone was tired, and our pace was slackening. We had given up all unnecessary conversations, keeping all our breath and strength to continue putting one foot in front of the other. How many thousands of steps did we still have to take? Our boots, the colour of the dusty universe, kept on across the rocky plain, which seemed to be leading us nowhere. The light wind filled our long, unkempt hair with dust. Our position in relation to certain reference points on the horizon seemed unchanging, and the rhythm of our steps, the sounds of our progress, and the wind itself became overwhelmingly monotonous. From time to time we could hear a rumble from the great hollow of emptiness which filled our stomachs. Just after the 11 o'clock halt, during which we consumed the last of our millet, an incident disturbed the general monotony. 2 twin-engined planes, which we had fortunately been able to see a long way off, appeared in the hot blue sky. The horizon was so vast that anything which crossed it was visible for at least 5 minutes before it reached us. We scattered as usual and assumed a position of anti-aircraft defence. Some of us were going to die. The planes were either light bombers or reconnaissance planes, but unmistakably Russian. The 2 planes flew over us at an altitude of about 1,500 feet. The snore of their engines pierced the gentle breeze and seemed to echo in the depths of our tense stomachs. The 2 Popovs took our fire without sending down anything in return. They flew in a large circle, which we followed with anguished eyes. The second time around, they would surely let us have it. However, their second swoop produced nothing but a swarm of white butterflies, flashing and fluttering against the blue of the sky. As soon as the planes were gone, some of our men went out to pick up the leaflets. A fellow came over to me waving a dozen. "Ivan doesn't seem to understand. If we can't eat, we can't crap. He's gone and sent us a lot of paper. We read the communist tracts. German soldiers, you have been betrayed. Surrender to our units, which will rehabilitate you. You have lost the war." Then, to raise our morale, we were shown some bad photographs of anonymous ruins, which, it was claimed, were German cities flattened by bombs. Also, there were photographs of smiling German prisoners. Under each of these photographs was a short caption: "Comrades, the temporary captivity which we are experiencing in no way resembles the lies we were led to believe. We have been agreeably surprised by the kindness of the camp officers. When we think of you, comrades, wading through the slime of the trenches to preserve the capitalist world, we cannot advise you strongly enough to lay down your arms." And so it went on. One fellow, who had managed to escape from Tom Voss, was shouting with rage. "The bastards! For all I know, I'm the only survivor from that damned place."